parents' unresolved trauma inevitably always ends up transferring onto the child. And it happens through kind of like a biopsychosocial process. And what I mean by this is that the trauma can be transferred biologically, but what I want to talk more so about in this video is how psychologically and kind of like sociologically the trauma gets transferred onto the child. Because of biology, that's just a bunch of fucking calculus and chemistry, but it's the psychology and sociology of it that really is intriguing and tragic. And it's sad. It's sad that there's so many people with trauma, whether the trauma is having experienced abuse in their childhood, whether they had been neglected, whether they grew up in a single parent household. We know that, not being raised by one of your parents is an adverse childhood experience. It's something that impacts the way, or potentially can impact the way that you think about yourself, others, the world. And when people experience these adverse childhood experiences, these traumas, they can be forever changed. And what I've seen in my life is that people with trauma oftentimes enter relationships and they are subconsciously looking to resolve their trauma through relationships. And one of the ways that people subconsciously deal with their trauma in relationships is by starting families. People feel that through having their own children, people with unresolved trauma feel that by having their own children, they'll be able to bring new life into this world and create a new reality for a new human being, and therefore this will help them recover from their own previous childhood trauma. It's something that's subconscious. It's something that oftentimes they're not really conscious of, but there's some research that suggests that we subconsciously sometimes go into relationships in order to kind of rectify unresolved childhood trauma. And I think at a more conscious level, people with trauma, and it's not just people with trauma, it's people even with lower levels of less severe trauma, that go into relationships because they have unmet emotional needs. And they go into relationships really more so out of a place of need rather than abundance and self-love and self-reliance and emotional independence. They go into relationships usually because they are emotionally dependent, unfortunately. And a big part of this is because they've experienced trauma. And of course they're going to go into relationships emotionally emotionally dependently, because the trauma at some earlier point in their life made them, it essentially, they were abandoned when they experienced trauma. For example, someone who is sexually molested, we're going to go there, experiences an abandonment. Let's say someone who's sexually molested by a parent experiences an abandonment. They experience a betrayal. And oftentimes when that's there, there's already perhaps maybe even some psychological some other mental or emotional trauma. There might already be some neglect happening. And what happens is that from concurring that trauma, they develop an emotional void. They feel betrayed, they feel unloved, they feel unsafe. They grow up with this emotional wound. And they go out into the world trying to resolve and distract themselves from the pain of that abuse. So let's switch the trauma to perhaps maybe not sexual abuse, but like grown up without a father. Grown up without a father can subconsciously send you the message that you are unworthy of his love. Or even at a conscious level, you are seeing that this person does not care about you, or he's not caring for you. Maybe we don't know if he doesn't care, but he's not caring for you. And what happens is that it can instill the core belief that you are worthless, that you are unloved, unlovable. It can instill deep feelings of low self-esteem. And what happens is that this child then grows into an adult. They enter friendships, they enter relationships, just like anyone else. But oftentimes they have this emotional hunger that's more intense. So let's connect back to the original point, which is parents who possess unresolved trauma. Basically what I'm talking about right now. People who go into relationships with mental wounds, emotional scars, and then decide that having a child could make them happy, and therefore resolve perhaps some of the early life abandonments that they had. This happens every day. This happens all of the time. And it's evident by children who exhibit mental health symptoms. And it's not to place judgment on parents, because oftentimes children who have lots of mental health symptoms have parents who have either previously had lots of adverse childhood experiences and their own mental health symptoms, and previously had mental health symptoms. So there's a connection between the child and the parent. And what I see is that oftentimes, the parent, they, just by having a child, do not solve and always get at the core of their emotional need. And some parents fortunately do. I do feel like some parents do heal after having children, and they're able to self-reflect, create a healthy environment for the child, one in which the child may not be exposed to arguments between both parents, or domestic violence, or just unsafety. But sometimes parents, even after having children, still have emotional scars, and they are still going about in the world trying to resolve the emotional scar. And one example of this is just like the example of the mother who has, let's say, maybe 2 baby daddies, who's always trying to look for love in a man, and for whatever reason, she's not with her 2 baby daddies. She's out, she's trying to look for a partner. The children feel kind of a little bit emotionally neglected because the mother's constantly trying to fulfill that emotional need from someone else. And, just as a side effect of that, the child feels kind of abandoned. And if this mother's constantly trying to find love, the child can ultimately develop these core beliefs that they are unworthy of being prioritized in their mother's life, that they are unworthy of love, that they are not enough. Maybe even that they caused the issue, if they see their mom suffering. And this is example, this is, it can be the dad. They could be They can feel like it's their fault that their dad is suffering. And this is the example of how trauma gets passed down. It starts with someone with unresolved trauma having a child, and then that not being enough for that person, not being enough to resolve the person's emotional needs, emotional void. Because ultimately what I feel like we've all agreed on as people is that other people do not resolve our issues. And what we've all agreed on is that we resolve our issues. We have to work on ourselves. We have to reflect. We have to reevaluate. We have to look within. We have to heal. And just because I bring a baby into this world does not mean that my issues are going to be resolved. If anything, your life is going to get more complex, and it's going to be even harder to heal. It's going to be harder. And I feel that this is why sometimes parents with unresolved trauma oftentimes transfer that trauma onto the child, whether through lack of care, or let's say two parents with unresolved trauma get a divorce, and this affects the child. It affects their identity. Once again, going back to my example earlier, the child might feel like it's their fault when in reality they had two parents with unresolved trauma that through in their relationship they realized that they couldn't save each other, and that actually when unresolved trauma meets more unresolved trauma, it kind of can create more mayhem, and that sometimes like the divorce is what happens, but that's not what the child sees. The child who is innately kind of self-centered, and I don't mean that in like a negative connotation, but in a sense that children are always feeling that they are the reason why they feel like they're like kind of like the center of the world. And you know, if mom and dad split up, sometimes they can feel like, oh my god, it's my fault. So that's one little example of how unresolved trauma can get passed down from parent to child. But it is almost always without fail where, you know, if you come across a child with trauma, like that, the parent will possess trauma as well. And you know, what is the solution for it then? And in my opinion, the solution is healing. It's promoting a society where people can discuss their traumas, can be open, can self-reflect, can be supported, can be understood, cannot be chastised, where people are not rejected or shamed for having trauma, making mistakes as a result of their trauma, but rather understood and empathized with, and encouraged to look within at their emotional needs and understand them as side effects of experiencing trauma. So I think that's a little bit of a solution. But, you know, I just had to give my 2 cents on this subject because it is really, truly a tragedy, a tragic subject. At the same time, it's also kind of like a scientific phenomenon. It's also it can be a little fascinating, kind of how it works, but I don't really mean to like say fascinating in regards to it's like a good thing, but it's actually kind of a very complex and very kind of like it's an area where I still feel like there needs to be a lot more understanding, and there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of kind of philosophical conversation that can be had, and not only philosophical, but like sociological, psychological, biological inquiry could be had. So that's kind of what I mean by fascinating. But at the end of the day, these things really do end up affecting our societies at writ large, and our communities, and the general population's mental health, because vicariously the general population gets gets affected by this too. So the key here is healing trauma, and that may look different to each different person. Of course, anytime it comes to people, to a human, to humanity, there's individual variability, and healing is going to look like different. People's traumas and scars are going to look different. People's individual biology is going to look different, and therefore their emotional healing is going to look different. And at the same time, there is still a universality. People share similar traumas. People share similar personality characteristics, and therefore they can also share similar pathways to healing as well. So I do think the community is important. Finding someone who can understand you, maybe someone who's gone through similar things, is a really critical thing. And I think friends and healthy family members are critical for that, for people with unresolved childhood trauma. But yeah, just my 2 cents on that subject. I would like to talk more about that subject. It's a subject that needs to be talked about more consistently, and I feel that needs to be further kind of like studied and brought to light. So that's that. Alrighty, everyone. Peace and love.